Now that we've talked a little bit about what we think about rigor, imagine that your class has just read some version of Little Red Riding Hood. I like to use Little Red Riding Hood because I assume you all know this story, but there was this lady in Wyoming who said, "Is this the one with the pigs?" No pigs. There is a wolf, no pigs. You may have to review the story a little bit at your tables. I want you in 2 minutes to come up with a basic comprehension question you might ask and a more rigorous question. And think of the things we talked about when we talked about rigor. Making some connections, being engaged, deeper thinking, a little bit more time. 2 minutes at your tables together, come up with 2 questions. What I want to do is reflect on what you were doing when you came up with those questions. Which of those 2 questions was the easier one to come up with? Why is the basic one easy to come up with?
It's right there.
It's a right there question. There's a yes, no, or a right answer. You've seen thousands of examples. You know what they look like. In 2 minutes, you could have come up with 20 of those, right? It's just easy, rolls off the tongue, right? But when you come up with a rigorous question, how does your thinking shift? Because your thinking isn't about the right there question, the easy answer, the obvious. It's not like questions you've asked before, because part of transfer is asking a different kind of question. So what did you have to be thinking about to come up with your rigorous question? What were some of the things that were going through your minds as you were talking at your tables?
The overall story.
The overall story. Sometimes I have seen great questions that don't really match the text. Like when I go into the text, I can't find the evidence in there. It seemed like it was a good question for some other text. So you really have to know the text. What's in the text that you can really tap into? That's one thing. What else do you have to know? Yes, sir.
Make sure the question is not closed-ended, not a yes or no question. Making sure that there is going to be some thought process there to answer the question.
Okay, it's an open question. It may have multiple possible correct answers. And how will you determine what's a good, right answer if multiple ones are possible? It's how they prove it, what evidence they provide, what explanations they offer to really explain their thinking. It's not going to be something that's obvious in the text. It's going to be an interpretation of the text. What else do you have to know or think about? Let's say you came up with 2 or 3 different ones. How would you decide which are the better ones? Or what? You had your hand up.
Well, I was just going to say, we were talking about with different grades, what would be an appropriate question for the different grade levels.
Okay, what are they ready for?
Right.
What kind of questions would be familiar enough that they could tap into something they know but stretch their thinking a little bit? So you're kind of thinking about what's the learning trajectory here and where are you going to go next with it? Because sometimes I see very engaging activities and questions, but it seems kind of like a zigzag, and kids are not really sure, are we still doing what we learned yesterday, or are we going in a different direction today? But you can still ask open-ended questions and take them deeper into a pathway you've already planned. Anything else?
We talked about how we could force the kids to have to make inferences, and you kind of hit on that.
Force them to make some inferences because it's not going to be an obvious answer. Yeah. We talked yesterday in the workshop, people said, I could see how you could argue this side or you could argue that side. We want to ask questions where they can see multiple possible answers before they decide which one am I going to focus on. In the old days, we used to go the opposite direction. Read this text and come up with the right answers, and I'll let you know if you got them right. And I remember being a poor reader in elementary school, I'd always wonder, how does all those other kids figure this stuff out? Because I could barely read, and I certainly couldn't figure it out, right? We never had to really do many inferring activities. It was just try to find something in the text that sounded like an appropriate answer. And if you felt you got lucky, maybe you got it right. Things have changed. We know that's not a good way to teach kids to read. Actually, I was such a poor reader, I made up the books I wrote book reports about in elementary school. Really, I did. I was smart enough I would go to the phone book and I'd find an author's name, character names. It was great. It was great. You didn't have to read. And in those days, of course, you didn't have the internet. You could just say, this was a book at my grandmother's house. She lives in another town. Sorry, I don't happen to have it with me. And teachers never wanted you to tell the whole story. So I'd just start a good beginning to a story, begin the plot, and I'd say, read the book and find out what happens. Unfortunately, there is no book. I got away with it till I was in 7th grade. That's a little scary. But it proves that I could fake it well enough because no one was demanding anything of me in reading a basal reader. You could pretty much look at the pictures and guess the answers without being a reader. And it wasn't until I got to college that I found out I had dyslexia. I said, wow, that explains a lot. But nowadays, we should know. We should know in an hour if our kids are readers or not. And we should have multiple strategies to get them there. Okay, so we know we have to think very differently about these types of questions. And we're going to come back to them, and you're going to revisit them again. But one of the things you need to do with a rigorous question, you need to help to word it in a way that kids know that they have to infer. They know they have to go somewhere for some evidence. And they know they have to explain the thinking behind it, not just summarize what was in the text. So, a little background on my matrix, because we'll be using that. When I left the school district I was working with, I started working with a consulting group. We worked with states, state agencies, school districts. And I was working in the state of Kentucky. They were revising their standards and their state assessment, and they had been using Bloom's taxonomy to define the rigor of the test questions and the rigor of the standards. And I said, you know, there's this new guy, Norman Webb, who just came out with a new framework. I think we ought to think about Webb's depth of knowledge framework because he talks about how deeply you have to interact with that content to understand it. And they were like, Karin, I think it's the same thing as Bloom's taxonomy. We know Bloom's taxonomy. They didn't want to connect this to something. It was a disconnect for them. And I didn't do a very good job of explaining why I thought Webb's was better. So I left Kentucky thinking, I've got to make that connection for them, and I didn't articulate it very well. So I first thought about Bloom's taxonomy. It came out in 1956 when I was in elementary school. Bloom and 3 other guys looked at test questions on college exams, and they said, you know, the test questions are knowledge, comprehension, and application. If you get to college, you ought to be thinking at higher levels, higher order thinking. That's kind of where that phrase came from originally. You ought to be analyzing, synthesizing, and evaluating in a college course. They were trying to push colleges. Over the years, it filtered down and was used in curricular work and eventually state assessment work, that kind of thing. Over the years, though, Benjamin Bloom wrote an article and he said, we got it wrong. We never should have put evaluation at the top of the taxonomy. You can teach someone how to evaluate something. You can teach them to use criteria to look at a novel or a model or a plan, but to come up with the novel, the piece of artwork or the plan takes a higher level of thinking because true synthesis is creating something new. So in 2001, David Krathwohl, who worked with Bloom on the original taxonomy, we don't know that because it's always called Bloom's taxonomy. It was just Bloom and 2 other guys, the 3 other guys altogether. They came out with a new one. They revised it. You notice that they changed some of the wording. They even moved some of the verbs. The problem still, though, is that those are generic verbs. So what is creating in an art classroom is not the same creating in a language arts classroom or a math classroom or a science classroom. Analyzing a piece of text, you don't use the same mental processing as you do when you analyze a math problem. Each domain has its own schema, and kids have to learn the language, the vocabulary of the schema. They have to know what the math terms mean so they can talk about them. They have to understand equivalence when they're talking about fractions. They have to understand setting and problem and conflict when they're talking about novels. So they have to learn it within the context of the discipline. And some of those verbs actually move around and are at multiple levels. So Bloom's gives us a hint about a taxonomy, but it doesn't give us all the pieces. When you look at Webb's depth of knowledge, now Norman Webb also was looking at test questions. He was looking at test questions in 4th and 8th grade state assessments. And he said there's a lot of recall and reproduction questions. You know it or you don't. Kids are reproducing something, pretty low level. And if they've never been exposed to it, there's no way they can really figure it out. So sometimes they feel like trick questions. Oh, we didn't read that book. We haven't had that unit in the math book, so we don't know how to do that skill. He described depth of knowledge, too, as an application, basic application, making a connection. These are questions like doing word problems in math. I have to read the problem and say, I think what I have to do is add, and now I have to perform addition. I have to make a decision before I can go on. But it's a routine kind of problem. Most of those kids are looking for keywords like what's the sum, what's the total, how many, how few. They're looking for keywords to figure that out. It's like asking for the main idea of a text. You have to read the whole text, and now you're putting together what's sort of bubbling to the top. So you have to know the whole text. It's a think and search question, where DOK1 is a right there question. But there's still routine. When you teach kids how to find the main idea, they know what to look for when they're looking for a main idea. He said a third type of question, and he didn't see very many of these, is when they have to use strategic thinking. This is more like a performance task in math, where it's non-routine. They haven't seen one like this before. They maybe are going to use addition to solve it, but they've got to do more than just the routine word problem. Sometimes I give this example. A DOK1 problem might be Sally has a lemonade stand. She sells so many glasses on Monday, so many on Tuesday, so many on Wednesday, and then there's a question. How many did she sell in all, or which day did she sell the most? That would be a depth of knowledge too. I've got to get the right information and do something with it. A DOK3 would be Bobby wants to buy a football. They're on sale for $11. He can earn money by doing shoveling snow, and he would make this much an hour. Maybe cleaning out garages, he'd make this much. And what is a possible way he could earn enough money in a week? Do you see how that's more open-ended? They still have to make decisions, but they can make choices, and they have to justify. If he shovels 4 sidewalks, one on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, he ought to have enough money, but someone else might come up with some other alternative, or I'll just go to Grandma's house because Grandmas are an easy touch, and she'll probably give me a tip. Or maybe she'll even buy me the football. So that's where developing the business plan, where the other one is solving for an answer. Okay? In reading, depth of knowledge 3 is explaining why you think a character learned a lesson. Or why did the author write this? What is the author's purpose in writing this? What's the theme of this? What's the message in this? That is open to interpretation, and the right answers are the ones that are well supported. DOK3 is one text, one problem, one concept, go deeply. It's a science investigation where you're collecting data to answer your question. What happens when I raise the temperature? How long will it take this to melt? How far will the little car go down the ramp? I'm predicting, and then I'm measuring, and I'm looking at my results. That's the DOK3. DOK4, extended thinking. That's when we decide what we want to learn as a small group or as a class, and we explore it, and we use multiple sources to do that. Or we simply use multiple sources to answer questions where we want to explore. But the idea of DOK4 is it's multiple sources of information. It usually takes longer. Earlier in the discussions, I heard some people saying, I like interdisciplinary projects. DOK4 is the interdisciplinary project where they're maybe reading different books or going to different resources or going out on the internet, and they're compiling information to come up with a presentation, a project of some type. And what Webb said was, Our standards talk about DOK 3 and 4 things, but our state assessments rarely assess those. That was his point. And he forced a lot of states to start thinking about, well, how could we do that? And really, a lot of states went with more open-ended DOK 3 questions, recognizing that a DOK 4 can best be assessed in your classrooms. It's the project. It's the reading multiple books. It's having the literacy circles, and they've all read books on a particular theme, and they do something at the end with that, maybe presentations. The other thing that Webb did, which was unique, is he had descriptors for DOK 1, 2, 3, and 4 for each content area. He had science, social studies, ELA, and math descriptors. So you could say, in a math test, I'll look for this in a DOK 3. In a reading test, I'll look for this. In a writing test, they'll actually be writing an essay, not editing or writing simple sentences. That was the reason I liked Webb, because I felt it articulated the content, the specifics of the content, more easily. So I want you now to turn and talk. What are some differences you see between Webb and Bloom? Because I can guarantee it's going to come up in your discussions at your schools. People know Bloom. They're familiar with that. And they'll say, how is this like? How is it different? So what would your response be? Talk at your tables.
I had them create a graph, but it was really easy.
Bloom's gives us the verbs as teachers that we want the students to be doing, but the depth of knowledge levels give us the tasks that the students will be performing so that we have a clearer understanding when we're planning our lessons. We're not just saying, okay, we're going to evaluate. What does evaluate really look like?
Right. Yeah, it's a good point. When teachers say, oh, my kids are synthesizing or they're analyzing, my next question has to be, what? What is coming after that verb? Because that's what's going to determine the complexity of the task you're giving them. I actually heard, I'm not sure which table, said something like, we sort of feel like, pat ourselves on the back, oh, my kids created something. We must be at the top of Bloom. And it maybe was a really easy thing to create. It didn't take much thinking, much time. It was fun and it was engaging. There's nothing bad about that. But you still have to go deeper at some point.